So my name is Alyx Duffy, and I work with the Canada Human Rights Trust. I know it's often the thing that everyone sort of shakes their head at the panels, but I do want to take a moment to say thank you to everyone, including Barb and Alicia at Family Services York Region, as well as Mickey for hosting this fantastic panel. And for you all for coming out and talking about and being involved in these conversations and in this discourse around what is built underneath the idea of gender-independent kids. And a lot of what's being discussed is distinct from discussion that we often have around sexual orientation. And I think that's just the note that I want to start this conversation on, because so far there's been a lot of conversation about broad understanding of LGBTQ community, which is important. It's an acronym, an initialism, technically, I suppose, that is used to represent a whole bunch of different identities. And all of those identities are brought together under the name LGBTQ. Some of you keeners might know the long form, LGBTQ2ISA+, etc. I mean, there's a longer form than that. There's a lot of identities that I don't know and don't include, not out of disrespect. And the idea is that those identities come together in an acronym like that one to represent solidarity, to represent a common struggle and a common hope for a world in which people can be treated with the respect, the dignity, and the human rights that we all deserve, but that some communities have been denied systematically. So I don't think I'm telling anyone theoretically anything that you don't know, but why I want to bring that up now is just because the conversation that I hope that we can have today is one that is unique to kids, in a sense, children, but also adults and communities at large that are talking about gender identity and gender expression, which is not sexual orientation and has nothing to do with sexual orientation. And so it's really important to remember that in all of conversation. All of us may have somewhere that we identify sexually on a spectrum of sexual orientation. We may also all identify it with gender identity or gender expression in different ways. And that means that in each one of us, there's an intersection there. But for the purposes of a conversation like this, it's really important to see that distinction and understand it, because treating or not treating necessarily, that's a particularly medicalized word in this context, but interacting with and creating safer spaces, creating more inclusive spaces for folks who are being stigmatized because of issues around gender identity and social understandings of gender expression. Understanding that and working to address that is something that's often unique from understanding and addressing inequalities that people face around sexual orientation. So I don't mean to start out sort of like lecturing. I can go stand behind the lectern if it makes more sense. But what I'm hoping to do is just start this conversation with an understanding that what we're talking about is something that is different and that is unique. So there's a long-standing discourse around lesbian and gay rights, particularly, a slightly less long-standing discourse around bi rights, but trans rights for many people is the Wild West in many ways, complete with all the problematic elements of that sort of colonial analogy. And so there's a lot of things that we need to think about in terms of this that are unique here. And so that's why this conversation is really exciting for me, and I hope it's as exciting for you in that context. Does that make sense? Can I start up with that and feel like we're sort of on the same page here? Nodding is good. Okay. Happy noises are also good. Thank you. Applause even better. So with that said, the context that I'm coming from is working with EGAL Canada Human Rights Trust. And what I do at EGAL is work as a Safer Schools youth facilitation and resource development officer, essentially. And so the work that I'm doing at EGAL is part of a much larger group of people, which is EGAL Canada Human Rights Trust, who are all working in different areas around issues of gender identity, gender expression, and how those relate to youth, and particularly in areas that we could talk about folks who might identify as gender nonconforming kids, gender independent kids, gender variant kids and children and youth. In many different ways we can use words to talk about these topics of gender identity and gender expression as they are expressed amongst youth. And so what I'm hoping to do today is to talk to different elements of the work that we're doing at EGAL. Some of the work I'm directly involved in, some I'm going to be sort of like representing different folks that I work with, different colleagues of mine as well, and some of the work that they've been involved in. So sort of in a nutshell, for those of you who don't know EGAL Canada, or EGAL Canada Human Rights Trust, or EGAL as we often call it for short, we're an organization with a history that spans over a decade at this point. Some of you might have become aware of EGAL through the struggle for same-sex marriage equality within a Canadian context. We were one organization alongside several others and a dedicated group of individuals and legal teams, et cetera, a number of people who were working very hard to secure same-sex marriage equality. Once that was achieved, the organization lost a great deal of support, partially because I think a lot of people thought the work was done at that point. You know, as the Macklemore song says, getting some sort of certificate on paper is a damn good place to start. Unfortunately, for many people, it seemed like it was a good place to finish. And so a lot of folks sort of turn their eyes other places. There are a lot of struggles, as we all know in this room. LGBTQ issues are not the only things that are on our minds when we think about a safer world, a more just and a more social world, so I don't blame people for wanting to do other stuff. But at the same time, the reality is, and we're here again today, so many years later, acknowledging that there's so much more work to be done. And so EGAL, in its current manifestation, as it's been built up over the last 5 or so years, has been working primarily on a number of different issues. And obviously, marriage equality is not high on that list, although there's a lot of conversation and solidarity with folks in other countries who are interested in pursuing the route of same-sex marriage equality, alongside interesting technical foibles around divorce and people coming and trying to get their marriages recognized from other countries, etc. So some interesting stuff there. But what EGAL's primary work and what I wanted to talk about today is around education. And so some of you may not know that EGAL is involved in a number of different projects working alongside and with educators, working with secondary school educators, working with elementary and primary school educators across provinces like Ontario, Newfoundland, territories like the Yukon Territory, as well as Manitoba. And so a lot of those pieces plug in as well with community organizations, frontline service providers, and folks who are looking to get a better understanding of how to interact with, serve, and ultimately become more welcoming and inclusive of LGBTQ communities writ large. Of course, I mean, speaking to what I mentioned at the beginning of my intro, that exploration of a large community or group of communities also involves specifically addressing ideas around the unique needs of each of the different letters of that acronym, and then the different and many different understandings of intersectional identities that make up someone who could fit under the L for lesbian. I mean, that's obviously not the only way that people identify. So there's a lot of different unique elements that play into that training, but I want to point that out because that's one of several important pieces that we do at EGAL around training, and that's something that's been happening. You may have come across it, some of you in this room already, in Ontario through the Safer Schools program that we've been working on here, where trainers are traveling around to a number of different schools with the support of the Ministry of Education to provide what in many instances starts out as a conversation around sort of LGBT 101, the basic issues, and then steps forward and hopefully even more forward into talking about more advanced topics and advanced issues. So once we've sort of got definitions, the distinction between sexual orientation and gender identity out of the way, then we can start talking about other ways of thinking about making safer and inclusive school spaces for everyone. And the bulk of that work is based on another piece of EGAL's work, which I wanted to bring up today, which is a survey that EGAL Canada Human Rights Trust worked on alongside researchers from the University of Winnipeg, and in conjunction with a number of different youth and students from across Canada. And I'll hold it up here, although it's probably ridiculously small and not totally accessible for everybody to see. This survey was called Every Class in Every School, the first national climate survey on homophobia and transphobia and biphobia in Canadian schools. And so that's a whack of a title. But the idea is that it was an exploration in a Canadian context of some of the issues that impact our students in schools and the broader implications that those impacts might have on students' lives. And what came out of this survey was that it's sort of something that many of us in this room probably suspected already, which is that many LGBTQ students in general feel much less safe at their schools than students who do not identify as LGBTQ. And the way that that broke down specifically became particularly interesting in that, as also maybe some of us in this room suspected, students who identified as trans, and trans is a broad label, so it can include people who also identify as genderqueer, gender nonconforming, gender independent. Students who fit into that broader label for the course of this study identified at much higher rates of feeling unsafe in schools. And feeling unsafe in particular areas in school. And so there's a number of things to take into consideration, but from a very basic standpoint, it's really important to acknowledge that showing up to school is usually the first step to getting good marks and getting what school has to offer us. Because the reality is that school isn't just offering us marks, as I'm sure many of you know, it's also offering us socializing opportunities and so many other more elements. So all of that to say, I'm being handed the polite time notice. Trans inclusion and safety in school is really significant, and the reality is that with the current state of schools across Canada and the way in which many schools, boards, and policies have not really taken into account the unique needs of all students for a safer and inclusive space around topics of gender identity and gender expression, trans students specifically suffer and are denied opportunity and denied access to a number of different really significant resources. So without sort of going on and on, I'm going to stop there and pass my microphone on down to Chelsea. But thank you very, very much, and I look forward to talking to you a little bit more about this work and questions.